Welcome back to Maybe Someday. I'm Christoph, and today we're talking about action camera settings on FPV drones. This is a question that I get asked about a lot. Even though I've only been doing FPV for a little over a year, I've been a cinematographer in the film industry for over 10 now, and I recently started to incorporate FPV into my commercial and filmmaking workflow. So I spent a lot of time over the last year playing around with camera settings and action cameras and figuring out exactly what the best settings are to get the best image when it comes to cinematic FPV. For the sake of this video, I'll be talking about action cameras like the GoPro or the Osmo Action or the Insta360 1R, but the fundamentals of what I'm talking about could be applied to bigger cinema cameras if you're using those as well. But if you're putting a Komodo on an FPV drone, I really hope that you've kind of done a lot of these tests already. Anyway, let's get into the camera settings. So starting with the picture profile, you're gonna wanna shoot with a flat or log picture profile. On the GoPros, it's called ProTune. On the Osmo and on the Insta360s, it's called log. And that's gonna give you the most dynamic range, which gives you the most flexibility in post when you're doing color correction. So the shadows will have a little bit more information, the skies will have a little bit more information, and the result is you get a better looking picture. I also like to shoot in the widest format possible and make sure I'm using the entire sensor. So in the case of the GoPros, that's a 4:3 sensor. So I shoot 4:3 wide. On the Osmo Action, it's 16:9 wide, and on the Insta360, I think it's also 16:9. Even if I'm going to be doing a 2:3:5:1 aspect ratio, I still like to have the whole picture there, and then I can kind of move things around in post if I want to reframe if needed. Especially if you're going to be using real steady with a GoPro, the image ends up going from a 4:3 to a 16:9 after it's been stabilized. So, having the most information there as possible to do your reframing after is always better. So when I'm using a GoPro, I always shoot 4:3 aspect ratio, 4K, and wide. And speaking of Real Steady, if you're shooting on a GoPro, Real Steady just is this next level stabilization software that does a much better job than Hypersmooth or the in-camera stabilization on most action cameras. The only thing is, if you're going to use it, you have to make sure you have your stabilization turned off on the camera. So I always fly with it off, and I do the stabilization in post. If you're using Real Steady, I'd recommend using a GoPro 6, 8, or 9. I've heard the 7 has some weird issues. And if you're shooting on the Hero 6, you have to change your frames per second to 30 for it to work. For some reason, it doesn't work in 24p. So unless I'm shooting on the Hero 6 and I need that 30 frames per second to use Real Steady, I almost always shoot at 24 frames per second when I'm doing cinematic FPV, just because it's really fast and you want to feel that speed, so you're probably not going to be slowing it down unless you're chasing something like a downhill mountain biker or a car and you might be wanting to do some slow motion stuff. But 9 times out of 10, I shoot 24 frames per second to get the most dynamic looking image. So generally in cinematography, there's this thing called the 180-degree rule, which basically means if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you want your shutter to be 1/48. And this is something I tested a lot with cinematic FPV because I generally wanted to try and shoot at 1/48, but I just found that the motion blur was actually too much because of how fast the drone is moving. And then you also get some weird artifacting from the stabilization because you're seeing little jitters and stuff when those micro movements are being smoothed out. So I found that 1/96 is kind of the sweet spot for cinematic FPV, where if you're flying close to something, you still get that really nice motion blur, but you don't get any of the artifacting from the stabilization. But if you're shooting at a higher frame rate, like 60 frames per second, you can kind of revert back to the 180-degree rule and shoot at 1/120. It's really only at 24 frames per second and maybe 30 frames per second where you want to be at a higher shutter speed. So ISO is basically the sensitivity of the sensor, and the lower the number, the cleaner the image, but the darker it is. So if it's a bright sunny day, 100 is no problem, and that's kind of where you want to be. Is ISO 100 is you're going to get the cleanest image possible. The highest I'll usually go on action cameras is 400 if I have to, like if it's lower light conditions or for whatever reason I just have to push the ISO. 400 is kind of, anything beyond that, it starts to fall apart. I've experimented a little bit with setting a minimum of 100 and a maximum of 400 if there's extreme changes in the lighting conditions, and the action cameras these days actually do a pretty good job of smoothing out those, adjustments to the exposure. So if you're just shooting a freestyle video or something where the exposure changing a little bit isn't a big deal, setting a min and a max is an okay option. Now, because we're locking all of these settings in and there's not a lot of wiggle room for exposure, I use ND filters to kind of dial the exposure in exactly where I want it to be. This is the Team Black Sheep ND filters. They have like a 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, maybe even a 64, and they slide right into my GoPro mount from Brain 3D. Usually for me, if it's a bright sunny day, an ND32 is kind of the sweet spot. Magic hour at the beginning or end of the day, I'll usually throw in an ND16 and that'll get me where I need it to be. And then I have a 4 and an 8 for indoor locations, or like if you're in a forest or something where there's not as much sunlight coming in, then usually an ND8 or an ND16 is probably where you need it to be. So I'd recommend having at least 2 of each one, because if you crash into something, there is a chance it could break, although these ones are pretty durable. This next thing isn't really a camera settings thing, but it's equally important, and that's to choose the right conditions to fly in. So in the case of the intro of this video, it was right after sunrise and there had been a fresh snowfall overnight, and it just made for like the perfect conditions to shoot in. And I really think that added a lot of wow factor to this video. So if you have any control over that, try and go and shoot when everything's popping off, and if you don't, make the best with what you can. But shooting in the perfect conditions might have more of an influence over what the final image looks like, more than any of the other things I talked about. As a bonus, as a way to appeal to a broader audience than just other FPV pilots, I think it's important to have something to focus on. So in the case of this video, there was that big red bridge, and we were flying through all these narrow passageways, and the audience could kind of predict what was going to happen next. I love watching freestyle videos as much as the next person, but I think for the average viewer who isn't an FPV pilot, it just starts to get a little bit overwhelming when they don't really understand what's going on. So for cinematic FPV, I think it's important that the audience can kind of predict what's going to happen next, and every once in a while you can subvert their expectations and throw something fun in there. But I think you really can tell a story even just with the B-roll of cinematic FPV if you do it right. Outro. So that's it for this one. It's just a quick one that I wanted to put together, but a lot of people have asked me about camera settings when it comes to FPV stuff. And I also feel like there's going to be a lot of new people entering the FPV space over the next week or so. Not sure why. But anyway, I'm going to leave it there. If you like this or you got something out of it, please do the thumbs up thing. That means a lot. If you have anything to add, let me know in the comments below. I check all of them. And please consider subscribing, because that would mean the world to me. And I will see you on the next one. Bye-bye.